It's just scrap, woman. Mr. Hemlock's voice was as coarse as the sawdust on his boots. He gestured with a calloused hand toward the gully at the edge of her property, where two of his men were rolling massive, discolored slabs of maple off a wagon. Does you a favor, really? Phil's that ditched Abigail stood on her side of the simple wire fence, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The late afternoon sun cast a long shadow behind her, making her seem smaller than she already was. The wood landed with a series of heavy, indifferent thuds, kicking up dust and crushing the wild grass. It was ugly stuff, riddled with dark, chaotic lines like ink spilled through its veins. Rot, most would call it. Useless for the clean, straight-grained lumber his sawmill prized. "This is my land, Mr. Hemlock," she said, her voice quiet but firm, not rising to meet his dismissive tone. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near his feet. "And I'm improving it for you. That wood's good for nothing but fungus and termites. It's either the gully or the burn pile, and my burn pile's full." He gave a curt nod to his men, who finished their work and climbed back onto the wagon. He looked her over once more, a 25-year-old widow on a patch of land that was too much for one person to handle, in his opinion. He saw a problem to be managed, not a person to be respected. "You ought to thank me." The wagon creaked as it pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust and a fresh scar on the earth filled with rejected timber. She stood there long after it was gone, the silence of the prairie settling back around her. 10 years later, standing in that same spot, he would remember the quiet defiance in her eyes and understand, with the crushing weight of hindsight, that dumping his garbage on her land was the most expensive mistake he had ever made. He had given her an empire, and he had done it for free. That first year, the pile of wood was a monument to his disrespect. It sat in the gully, a tangled mass of graying timber that Abigail tried her best to ignore. The ranch, left to her by her husband, Thomas, felt vast and empty, its silence a constant reminder of her loss. The days were long, marked only by the sun's slow journey across the immense sky. She tended the small vegetable garden, mended the fences, and cared for the 2 horses and handful of chickens that were her only companions. Her father-in-law, Samuel, a man of few words and deep kindness, would ride over once a week. He never offered advice or pity. Instead, he would silently inspect the water pump, or sharpen the axe, or, one afternoon, spend 2 hours in the barn honing the set of woodworking tools that had belonged to Thomas. He'd left them gleaming on the workbench, the steel edges keen and ready. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder on his way out, a gesture that said more than 1,000 words of encouragement ever could. One sweltering afternoon in late summer, drawn by a morbid curiosity, she finally walked down to the gully. The wood smelled of damp earth, of fungus, and of a faint, sweet decay. She ran a hand over one of the slabs. The surface was rough, weathered by its journey from the forest to the mill and then here, its final resting place. But beneath the grime, she saw the dark, intricate line she had noticed before. She remembered Thomas, a man who had loved the character of wood, once holding up a small piece of oak with a prominent knot. "Some see a flaw," he'd said, his voice gentle. "I see where the tree fought a battle and grew stronger." She wondered what story these strange lines told. Acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, she put her shoulder into the smallest slab, wrestling its dead weight out of the tangle and dragging it, inch by painful inch, up the slope to the barn. The effort left her breathless, her dress stained with dirt, but as she stood in the dusty, cathedral-like quiet of the barn, a flicker of something other than grief stirred within her. She looked at the slab, then at the row of sharpened tools. She spent the next year in that barn. The first pass of Thomas's old hand plane across the surface of that forsaken maple was a revelation. The tool, heavy and solid in her grip, peeled back the gray, weathered skin to reveal a world of impossible beauty beneath. The dark lines were not rot, but artistry. They swooped and swirled in delicate, spidery patterns of black and brown against the creamy pale wood, each design unique, chaotic, and utterly captivating. It was called spalting, she would later learn, the result of fungi drawing territorial lines within the wood. It was a record of a silent, microscopic war, and the result was a masterpiece. The discovery changed everything. The barn was no longer a place of ghosts and memories, but a sanctuary of purpose. Every morning, she would rise with the sun, and after her chores were done, she would retreat to its dusty light. She learned the heft and balance of each tool, the way the saw sang through the grain, the satisfying curl of a perfect shaving from the plane's edge. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong. She learned the language of the wood, its tensions and its tendencies. This spalted maple was temperamental. It was softer in some places, harder in others, and demanded a patient, attentive hand. She made mistakes. Joints didn't fit, cuts went askew, and more than one piece ended up on her own firewood pile. But with each failure, she learned. She wasn't trying to force the wood into a shape it resisted. She was trying to listen to it. She started with a simple box, then a small shelf. Her focus was absolute. In the rhythmic scrape of the plane and the tap of the mallet, the crushing silence of her life was filled with the sound of creation. One afternoon, she decided to build something for herself, something substantial. She selected 3 of the most beautifully figured slabs and began the slow, methodical process of building a kitchen table. It took her a month. The design was simple, almost severe, for straight legs, a thick top, no ornamentation. The wood itself was the decoration. When it was finished, she and Samuel carried it into her small cabin, replacing the rickety, time-worn table that had been there for years. The new table felt like an anchor. It was solid. It was hers. Samuel circled it slowly, his gnarled fingers tracing the dark lines on the polished surface. He looked at her, then back at the table. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "Thomas would have liked that," he said, his voice raspy. "The grain tells the story." The new table was a source of quiet pride, but pride couldn't buy flour or lamp oil. Her savings were dwindling, and the reality of her situation was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety beneath the surface of her work. She needed to find a way to make the ranch, and her newfound skill, provide for her. She looked at the growing stack of smaller, well-made objects in the corner of the barn, a set of bookends, a small cabinet, a few sturdy stools. They were practice pieces, but they were solid and true. An idea, both terrifying and necessary, began to form. She chose a set of 3 nesting stools, their tops displaying a spectacular burst of spidery black lines, and loaded them onto the old buckboard wagon. The journey to the town of Redemption was 10 miles of dusty, rutted road. The town itself was a single street, flanked by a saloon, a blacksmith, a church, and the mercantile that served as its hub. The mercantile's owner, Mr. Gable, was a man whose personality was as dry as the dust on his shelves. He peered at her stools over his spectacles, one eyebrow raised in skepticism. "What's this, then?" he asked, tapping a finger on the wood. "Some kind of spoiled lumber." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. "It's spalted maple," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's strong," he grunted, unconvinced. He rocked one of the stools back and forth, testing its sturdiness. It didn't wobble. He was a practical man, and he respected solid construction, even if the material looked peculiar. "Can't say there's much call for furniture that looks like it's got a disease," he said bluntly. "I'll give you $5. In store credit it was a pittance. The work had taken her weeks. But it was more than she had when she woke up that morning. She swallowed her disappointment and agreed. As he was carrying the stools inside, the door chimed and a woman entered. It was Mrs. Albright, the wife of the town's only doctor. She stopped short, her eyes fixed on the stools in Mr. Gable's hands. "Good heavens, what are those?" she exclaimed. "The patterns are extraordinary." Mr. Gable, sensing an opportunity, set them down. "Just took them in." From the widow out at the old Thomas place, Mrs. Albright circled them, her gloved hand hovering over the wood. "They're beautiful. Like pen and ink drawings. I'll take them all." "How much?" Before Mr. Gable could invent a price, she opened her reticule. "Is $20 enough?" It was 4 times what he had offered. Mr. Gable's eyes widened slightly as he took the cash. Abigail, who had been about to leave, stood frozen by the door. Mrs. Albright turned to her, a warm smile on her face. Did you make these, my dear? Their wonderful Abigail could only nod, a slow, dawning realization spreading through her. Someone else saw what she saw. News of the widow's strange would traveled through the small community in the way that only small-town gossip can. It was a curiosity, something to be talked about over the fence or at the church social. Mrs. Albright displayed her nesting stools proudly in her parlor, and soon Abigail received a few tentative orders. The blacksmith wanted a sturdy chest for his tools. The pastor's wife asked for a new bookshelf for the parsonage. These were small, practical commissions, paid for mostly in trade: a side of bacon, a new set of horseshoes, a sack of winter wheat. It was enough to sustain her, but she knew her skills had a ceiling. Her joinery was simple and strong, but it lacked the refinement she saw in her mind's eye. She could make a box, but she didn't know how to make it elegant. The grain told the story, but as she worked, she felt she was only reading the first chapter. Samuel, on one of his visits, mentioned a name: Alistair. An old cabinet maker who lived alone deep in the wooded hills, a man who had a reputation for being as difficult and unyielding as the old-growth oak he favored. He took no apprentices and suffered no fools. He was, Samuel said, the best there was. The idea took root. A week later, Abigail packed a small, meticulously crafted box, her finest work, with hand-cut dovetail joints, and made the day-long ride to Alistair's remote cabin. She found him splitting firewood, a wiry man with sharp blue eyes and a face like a topographical map. He barely glanced at her as she stated her purpose. "I don't take apprentices," he said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't stop the rhythmic swing of his axe. She held out the box. He paused, wiping his brow with the back of a leathery hand, and took it from her. He turned it over and over, his thumb tracing the lines of her joinery. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "The grain tells the story," he murmured, quoting a wisdom so universal it felt like it belonged to all craftsmen, "but your hands are shouting over it." He pointed to one of the joints. "Your lines are hesitant. You measured 3 times and still didn't trust your saw." He handed the box back. It felt like a lead weight. Just as she was turning to leave, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He grunted. "Wait." He disappeared into his workshop and returned with 2 small blocks of wood and a razor-sharp chisel. He handed them to her. "Cut a mortise and tenon joint. A blind 1 inch." He gestured to a nearby stump. "You can work there." He went back to his woodpile, leaving her to the impossible test. She had never cut a blind joint before. It was a task that required precision, confidence, and a deep understanding of the wood's structure. She took a deep breath, the scent of pine and sawdust filling her lungs. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the patience the spalted maple had taught her. She worked slowly, her entire world shrinking to the 2 small blocks of wood in her hands. An hour later, her hands aching, she was done. The joint wasn't perfect, but it was clean. She walked over to Alistair and presented it to him. He took the 2 pieces, inspected them from every angle, and slid them together. They fit snugly, with no gaps or wobble. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. "Come back next week," he said, turning back to his work. "Bring your own steel." The next 2 years were an education in silence. Alistair was not a man for lectures or lengthy explanations. He taught by doing, and he expected Abigail to learn by watching. She would spend 3 days a week at his workshop, her buckboard parked under a tall pine. Her days were filled with the repetitive, meditative tasks of the craft, sharpening blades until she could shave the hair on her arm, planing boards to a perfect, glass-like smoothness, cutting endless practice joints. Alistair would demonstrate a technique once, his movements economical and precise, and then leave her to replicate it. His only feedback was a grunt of disapproval or a rare, quiet nod of acceptance. He taught her to read the tension in a board, to anticipate how the wood would behave under the saw, to use the grain not just as decoration but as a source of structural strength. He showed her how to make the wood bend to her will without breaking its spirit. The phrase Samuel had passed down, "the grain tells the story," took on a new, profound meaning. It was a philosophy. It was about honesty in construction, about letting the material's inherent nature guide the form, about creating something that was true to its origins. Under his taciturn guidance, Abigail's work transformed. The hesitancy in her hands disappeared, replaced by a quiet confidence. Her designs remained simple, rooted in the practicalities of frontier life, but the execution became flawless. The spalted maple, once a curiosity, became her signature. She learned to showcase its wild beauty, framing the chaotic patterns within clean, strong lines, creating a striking contrast that was uniquely her own. Her local reputation grew. She was no longer just the widow who made odd furniture, she was a craftswoman of considerable skill. Then came the second discoverer. A traveling merchant named Mr. Quinn, who supplied luxury goods to the wealthy ranchers and mining magnates dotted across the territory, was passing through Redemption. He stopped at the mercantile and saw a blanket chest Abigail had built for Mr. Gable. He ran his hand over the top, his expression one of pure astonishment. He had seen furniture made of oak, cherry, and walnut, but he had never seen anything like this. He bought the chest on the spot and asked Mr. Gable who had made it. That afternoon, Mr. Quinn's fine carriage rolled up the dusty lane to Abigail's ranch. He was a man who recognized quality and, more importantly, opportunity. He commissioned a set of 6 dining chairs for a client in the territorial capital, a woman with a taste for the unique and the money to afford it. The price he offered was more than she had earned in the entire previous year. The stakes had just been raised. The 6 dining chairs were the most challenging project she had ever undertaken. Each one had to be identical in dimension yet unique in its grain. The work required a level of precision that tested the very limits of her training with Alistair. For 2 months, her workshop was a flurry of careful measurements, precise cuts, and painstaking assembly. When they were finished, they were magnificent. They were strong and elegant, the dramatic black lines of the spalted maple flowing across the seats and up the backs, making each chair a functional piece of art. Mr. Quinn was ecstatic. He paid her in cash and transported the chairs himself, handling them with the care a museum curator would afford a priceless artifact. A month later, a letter arrived, a rare occurrence that sent a ripple of unease through Abigail. It was from the client, a Mrs. Sterling, wife of a man who was making a fortune building railroads. She expressed her profound delight with the chairs and included a startling request: she wanted to visit the workshop and discuss a much larger commission in person. The idea of a woman of Mrs. Sterling's stature coming to her remote, dusty ranch was almost unthinkable. Abigail spent a week cleaning the cabin and workshop until they were spotless, a frantic energy possessing her. The day Mrs. Sterling's carriage arrived, pulled by 2 magnificent black horses, Abigail felt a familiar tremor of nervous inadequacy. But Mrs. Sterling was not what she expected. She was a sharp, intelligent woman with an appreciative eye, dressed elegantly but without pretension. She wasn't interested in the rustic charm of the cabin, she wanted to see the work. Abigail led her to the barn. Mrs. Sterling walked through the workshop, the scent of sawdust and wood finish in the air. She touched the tools, ran a hand along a half-finished table type, and then her eyes fell on the source of it all, the great, jumbled pile of wood still mouldering in the gully. Abigail felt a flush of embarrassment, but Mrs. Sterling walked right up to it, her fine shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. She looked from the raw, ugly slabs to the gleaming, finished chairs in Abigail's workshop. "So this is it," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "This is where it comes from." She saw the whole story, the rejection and the redemption. She turned back to Abigail, her decision made. "I am building a new home," she announced. "I want you to furnish my dining hall. A table to seat 12, the chairs to match, and a sideboard. Spare no expense. I want your work, made from this wood." The figure she named was astronomical. It was enough money to buy the ranch outright, to hire help, to build a future she had never dared to imagine. It was the commission of a lifetime, and the weight of it, the sheer, terrifying possibility of failure, settled onto Abigail's shoulders like a physical thing. The following 2 years were a blur of focused, relentless work. The Sterling Commission consumed Abigail's life. She spent the first month just selecting the wood, walking among the slabs in the gully, now seeing them not as a pile but as a library of possibilities. She chose pieces where the grain flowed in long, elegant sweeps for the tabletop, and others with tight, dramatic bursts of pattern for the chair backs. The project was too large for one person. With a portion of Mrs. Sterling's generous advance, she hired 2 young men from town, brothers named Finn and Daniel. They were hard workers, eager to learn a trade, and Abigail found herself in the unfamiliar role of teacher. She passed on the lessons Alastair had given her, teaching them the patience and respect the wood demanded. She taught them that the grain tells the story was not a suggestion, but a rule. The barn was no longer large enough. She used more of the advance to hire a crew to expand it, adding a large, window-lined main room and a separate finishing room to protect the pieces from the ever-present dust. Her small, solitary operation was transforming into a proper business. She was no longer just a woodworker, she was a proprietor. She managed payroll, ordered supplies, and oversaw every stage of production. The dining set took 18 months to complete. When it was finally done, it was more than just furniture, it was a statement. The massive table, its top a single, breathtaking expanse of swirling black and cream, stood on a powerful trestle base. The 12 chairs were a chorus of harmonious variations on a theme. The sideboard was a monument of quiet elegance and flawless construction. Transporting it was a logistical nightmare, requiring a specially built wagon and a slow, careful journey. But its arrival and installation in the Sterling mansion created a sensation. Word of the railroad baron spalted maple spread like wildfire among the wealthy elite. Orders began to flow in, first as a trickle, then as a steady stream. They came from San Francisco, from Denver, from back east. Abigail's furniture, born from discarded scrap in a dusty barn, became a symbol of rustic sophistication and discerning taste. The pile of wood in the gully, once a seemingly endless resource, began to shrink. It was no longer a mark of shame but her most valuable asset, the foundation of her burgeoning empire. 10 years to the day after Mr. Hemlock had dumped his first load of scrap into her gully, another wagon creaked to a stop at her fence line. It was Hemlock himself, his face etched with the lines of a decade of hard work and diminishing returns. He was older, his shoulders stooped, his sawmill struggling. The vast tracts of prime timber that had once seemed limitless were now logged out, and he was forced to take whatever he could get. He looked past Abigail, his eyes taking in the scene. The small cabin was the same, but next to it stood a sprawling, handsome workshop, alive with the sounds of saws and hammers. Several large, enclosed wagons, bearing the simple brand of her initials, were being loaded with carefully wrapped furniture by a team of men. The gully, once overflowing, was now nearly empty, holding only a few remaining slabs. Hemlock climbed down from his wagon, his movements stiff. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning grey hair, the gesture full of a weary awkwardness. He cleared his throat. "Afternoon," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the workshop. "Heard you've done well with that." Scrap, the word hung in the air between them. Abigail stood in the same spot she had 10 years ago, but everything was different. She was no longer the fragile, grieving widow. She was the master of this domain, her quiet confidence as solid and unshakable as the furniture she built. "It spalted maple," she said, her voice even and calm. It was the same sentence she had spoken to him before, but now it was not a correction, it was a declaration. He finally met her eyes, and in his, she saw a grudging respect born of utter astonishment. He couldn't comprehend how she had turned his trash into a treasure that had made her reputation across the territory while his own fortunes declined. He swallowed the lump of pride in his throat. "Thing is," he started, looking down at his dusty boots, "I've got another load. Back at the mill. Some big logs, came in with a fungus. My foreman says it's worthless, says to burn it." He looked up again, the question plain on his face. "I was wondering if you'd be interested in buying it." The reversal was complete. The power had shifted so entirely, so quietly, that there was no need for triumph. She didn't smile. She didn't remind him of his past arrogance. She simply held his gaze. "I'll take a look at it," she said. It was the quietest, most profound victory of her life. Mr. Hemlock nodded, relieved, and climbed back onto his wagon, leaving without another word. Abigail watched him go, the dust settling in his wake just as it had a decade before. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and deep purple. From the workshop, she could hear the rhythmic rasp of a handsaw and the low murmur of Finn and Daniel discussing a difficult joint. It was the sound of her life, a life she had built with her own 2 hands from the things another man had thrown away. She walked back toward the barn, her boots making soft prints in the dry soil. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil. She walked over to the workbench that had once been Thomas's. On it, next to a set of plans for a new commission, lay the old hand plane. She picked it up. The smooth, worn wood of the handle felt like an extension of her own hand. It was the first tool she had used, the one that had peeled back the ugly surface of that first slab to reveal the beauty within. It had been his, now it was hers. The handle was shaped not only by his grip, but by her own. It was a bridge connecting the woman she had been to the woman she had become. She thought of the wood. The strange, beautiful, flawed wood. It had taught her everything. It had taught her that value is a matter of perspective. It had taught her that strength often grows from a wound. It had taught her that the most interesting stories are rarely found in the straight, perfect grain, but in the complex, chaotic lines of a life that has endured. The grain tells the story. Her own life had a new grain now, one she had shaped herself. And so you learn that the world will often discard what it doesn't understand. It will call it scrap, it will call it flawed, it will dump it in a gully and turn its back. But the real work, the quiet work, is to walk over to that forgotten pile, pick up a piece, and find the story waiting within. To plane away the rough exterior and reveal the character that was always there, hidden just beneath the surface. What has the world discarded in your own gully? And when will you begin the work of showing its true worth?